Welcome back, everybody. We are skipping ahead to section 10.6, which is using the quadratic formula. Now, I will say, as we're skipping a section, just want to point out section 10.5 is completing the square. This is another way that or another method we can use to solve quadratic equations. It is a great method, but we are going to skip this one in order to focus more of our time that we have left on the quadratic formula. I would encourage you to take a peek at that. It's another method that is often used, can be really helpful. It's also the method that's used to show how we can generate the quadratic formula that we'll be talking about today. So if you take a look at completing the square, you can also look at how we can find the quadratic formula. That's all on page 585. We are going to skip ahead to what is the quadratic formula. This is where does it come from? So how we get that and how we can use completing the square to do that is all on page 585. And it starts with the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And when we do this, it kind of goes backwards through. How could we use this and show the solution x? X equals what? The quadratic formula is actually when we solve for x, and it shows us how we can do that. What do we get? Let's see what that is. You can see this on page 586. If ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and a is not equal to 0, then x is negative b plus or minus. Means we're going to add this and subtract the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. Notice all of that, b squared minus 4ac, is in the square root symbol, all divided by 2a. There are lots of ways to remember this. I know this is a long formula, but notice there's b, a, and c, and a, and those all come from these numbers out in front. We can simply plug those in, and we're able to get what are the value or values of x. Sometimes you'll hear this, a one way to remember it. Sometimes you'll hear that using Pop Goes the Weasel. The quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There's lots of ways to remember this, but I would encourage you, this is a great formula to learn to know well. We'll use it, but it might be worth just spending some time trying to memorize it so that you know it really well. So looking at example 1, we can see how can we use this formula to solve for x. Here's example 1, is x squared plus 6 equals 5x. Well, already we can see we're not yet in this quadratic equation set equal to 0. I need to have all of my terms, my x squared, x, and constants all on one side of the equation. Right now I have this 5x on all by its lonesome over here, so I'm actually going to subtract that term from both sides of the equation. Remember, we do that to each side of the equal sign. When I go to subtract 5x, there are no like terms, so it stays minus 5x plus 6. You may notice I put that in the middle just to really put this in this ax squared plus bx plus c term or form equals 0. Now I can go in and I can say, what are my a, b, and c values since I'm going to use those in the quadratic formula? Well, my a, there's no number in front of x squared, so a is 1. B, the number in front of x is negative 5. Remember that subtraction sign can be rewritten as plus and negative. And then c is positive 6. A, b, and c I now plug into my quadratic formula. That formula is at the top of page 586 if you need to look again. X equals negative b, or the opposite of b. The opposite of a negative, that number is going to be positive. Plus or minus, meaning that we're going to have to actually add this and subtract, the square root of b squared, so negative 5 in parentheses squared. Take a second to pause and think, why are we putting that in parentheses? Remember that if we do not place that in parentheses, the negative is separate. But when it's in parentheses, negative 5 is the base. So that squared will be positive. Next, so b squared minus 4 times a, that's 1, times c is 6, all over 2 times, in this case, 1. Let's simplify that. X equals, opposite of negative 5 is positive 5, plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared is positive 25, minus 4 times 1 times 6 is 24, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Another simplifying step, x equals 5 plus or minus the square, put a little line here to help us. This is where we've started another line of this. Square root of 25 minus 24 is 1, all over 2. And what is the square root of 1? X equals 5 plus or minus 1 divided by 2. That's the square root of 1 is 1. Now that we've simplified everything else, I need to use this plus or minus and say that's actually going to be 2 different, move that out of the way. That's going to be 2 different numbers in my outcome. Okay, the first one, x equals 5 plus 1 divided by 2. And the second one, x equals 5 minus 1 divided by 2. Plus or minus, we've seen in other examples that it is usually or often we have more than one answer, and that's going to be true in this case. 5 plus 1 divided by 2 is 6 divided by 2, which simplifies to 3. X equals 3. 5 minus 1 is 4 divided by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So my 2 answers can be x equals 3 and x equals 2. Just like we've been doing, these are also known as the roots, the zeros. We can call these the solutions. This is the point where we will see this graph cross the x-axis. And so that's helpful as we graph, but it's also our solution to this. I would encourage you to try quick check 1A and B and go through these steps. Show your work in an organized fashion, keeping in mind that A, already solved, equal to 0, but B, you'll need to do a step to get that equal to 0. Pause your video and try those 2 problems. All right, coming back for A, when we solve this, we are left with x equals 4 and x equals negative 2. And for quick check 1B, you can pause now and try that if you have it. Okay, our answer is x equals 13 and x equals negative 9. And if you got that and feel confident, you are welcome to move on to the next video. I am going to show the work to get those answers right now. But if you are all set to go, you can move on to our next problem. First step here, x squared minus 4x equals 117. I need to get all of my terms on one side of that equation. So I subtract 117 from both sides. X squared minus 4x minus 117 equals 0. And already we can see where this is helpful. I would not want to be finding the 2 numbers whose product was 117 and sum was negative 4. And so we're going to use our quadratic formula. A is 1. B is negative 4, and C is negative 117. X equals the opposite of B, so the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4, plus or minus the square root of B squared, I put that in parentheses, minus 4 times 1 times negative 117. All divided by 2a. Oh, 2 times 1. We know what a is. And I start to simplify. X equals 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared is positive 16. That's because that base, negative 4 times negative 4, makes a positive. Minus negative 4, 4 times 1 times negative 117. Check on my calculator for that product. 4 times 117 is 468. Now, I have minus and a negative, and I keep those, minus and a negative, which is going to be addition. When we subtract a negative, we add the opposite, all over 2. X equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 plus 468, 484, all over 2. And just a quick, in your calculator, when we want to find the square root of a number, like 484, if you push the blue button, and then x squared, we can take the square root of something. So I'm going to take the square root of 484 is 22. Move over here, just so you see where my work goes. X equals 4 plus or minus 22 all over 2. Now is the point where we split this into 2 separate equations. One is plus and one is minus. X equals 4 plus 22 divided by 2. And x equals 4 minus 22 divided by 2. 26 divided by 2, that's when we add 4 plus 22, is 13. And then negative 18 divided by 2, a negative divided by a positive is a negative. We'll keep looking at the quadratic equation and continue to practice it. Just keep trying these and plugging in and simplifying. We do the same steps each time, but it is worth the practice.